He thought he was done with people, done with places. So he bought a forgotten house at the edge of town for just $10. But behind its broken door, beneath the weight of silence, lay a wounded German shepherd with a belly full of life and a past full of scars. She didn't bark. She just watched him and stayed. Have you ever met a soul, animal or human, that saved you just by not leaving? Stay with this story. It might stay with you. The truck's engine coughed twice before falling silent, its final rattle fading into the hush of late autumn. Will Harlan stayed behind the wheel, hands resting on the cracked steering, watching the pale light spill across the windshield. Through the glass, the house waited, an outline against a sky the color of old tin, roof sagging, porch tilting toward earth as if bowing to another year gone by. Will let his breath out slowly. In the quiet cab, the ticking of his father's pocket watch, fastened to the dashboard with a frayed leather string, marked time not in seconds, but in memories. Each tick seemed to echo in his ribs, a sound as familiar as the loneliness that trailed him these last few years. He didn't get out right away. Instead, he watched the wind shudder through the maple and birch, sending a dry cascade of leaves across the gravel drive. They swirled in the low gold sun, catching for a moment on the splintered fence, then tumbling onward, untethered. The air was thin with the coming cold, and even through the closed window, Will could taste it, sharp, honest, without a hint of sweetness. He reached for the small suitcase on the passenger seat, the canvas worn thin where his hand had gripped it too many times. Only the essentials inside, a few changes of clothes, an old thermos, a faded photograph tucked into a battered wallet. There was nothing left in his old apartment worth bringing here. No houseplants, no framed diplomas, not even the creased uniform shirts that once bore his name and the badge of Birchfield's police chief. He had shed those things, bit by bit, in the slow unraveling that followed the funerals, the paperwork, the empty days that trailed behind loss. Now there was just this house at the edge of town, bought for $10 and a whisper of hope that something different might begin. Or maybe he was only running out of places to go. He opened the door. The cold met him without apology, lifting the fine hair on his arms beneath his flannel shirt. Will listened as his boots found gravel, the sound quiet and rough. Like the voice he used so little these days, the house loomed before him, not large but substantial, made from thick planks now softening at the edges, paint long since peeled to reveal the grayed grain beneath. Its windows were milky, catching the last of the sun in uneven panes, and the porch stairs creaked even before he set foot on them, as if remembering too many storms. He paused with one hand on the chipped wooden rail. For a moment, he was a boy again, walking home after baseball, or after he'd lost a fight at school, the porch light a beacon in the dusk. But the house gave no welcome. Only the faint scent of dust and leaf mold drifting through the door's weathered frame. Will stepped inside. The entryway was shadowed, the air holding the hush of long absence. He closed the door softly behind him out of old habit, and stood in the gloom, letting his eyes adjust. The silence here was heavier than he'd known in years, a thick, patient thing that seemed to settle over his shoulders and press against his chest. He set his suitcase down by the baseboard, the motion stirring a faint swirl of dust motes in the last shaft of light. The floor groaned under his weight, announcing his presence to no one. There was little furniture, a rocking chair with one arm splintered, its paint faded to the color of ash, a wooden side table with 3 legs, the ghost of a rug pattern beneath years of footprints and neglect. The fireplace was blackened with old soot, stones cold and unswept. Will moved slowly through the house, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the door frames, pausing at the marks in the wood, old measurements of some forgotten child's growth, a single nail where a picture had once hung. In the kitchen, a cracked window let in the scent of rain from somewhere far off. The cabinets were empty, their doors hanging open, as if waiting for an answer. He walked back to the living room and lowered himself onto the rocking chair. It creaked under his weight, then settled into stillness. Through the dust-fogged window, he watched the fading light slip across the floorboards, painting long stripes that climbed up the far wall before disappearing entirely. Will sat there for a long time. He did not speak, not even to himself. His hands rested on his knees, fingers knotted together, the old watch ticking steadily at his chest. Outside, the wind rose, sending a scatter of maple leaves against the porch steps, their sound as soft as a whisper, like someone calling from another room or another life. He watched the dust drift in the quiet. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, one sharp note, then silence. The loneliness in that sound settled deep inside him, but Will did not move. He only listened, the house listening with him. Two old survivors waiting for something, perhaps hope, perhaps nothing at all, to cross the threshold. Night crept in slow and gray, pressing against the windows. Will closed his eyes, feeling the ache of long travel in his bones. In this hollow house with its quiet and its waiting, he let his heart beat slow and heavy, and told himself that maybe, just maybe, he had come home. The next morning, Will woke before the sun. For a moment, in that blue hush between sleep and waking, he forgot where he was. Only the hollow ache in his chest reminded him. He made a cup of black coffee from an old tin kept in the suitcase, standing at the kitchen counter with his breath ghosting the cracked window pane. The coffee was bitter, but he welcomed its warmth on his tongue. He decided to begin clearing out the basement. The air inside the house still felt close, like something left unspoken. With a work shirt buttoned over his flannel and a flashlight in one hand, Will found the door under the back stairs and pulled it open. The hinges groaned, a sound that lingered in the old house's throat, somewhere between warning and invitation. He hesitated on the top step. A musty cold rose from below, sharp with the smell of earth and damp, tinged by the iron tang of rust. Will moved slowly, boots finding their way along each creaking stair, the cone of his flashlight dancing along stone and cobweb. Halfway down, he stopped, listening. It was almost nothing, a faint scuffle, maybe the tail end of a dream. He waited, senses sharpening as they once did on late-night calls. The basement opened before him, unfinished, the walls braced with beams blackened by time, shelves tilting beneath jars of nails and paint flaking off in strips. In one far corner, behind an old rolled-up rug and a battered trunk, Will caught movement, subtle like the flutter of a curtain in wind. He narrowed the light, and there she was, a German shepherd, large but shrunken now by hunger and hardship, curled in on herself atop a rotted square of blanket. Her fur was tangled and dulled with old dirt. One ear, notched at the tip, twitched as the light caught her, and her eyes, deep, lucid, unblinking, fixed on Will with a stillness that struck him harder than any bark or growl. He did not approach. Instead, Will crouched where he was, careful to keep his voice soft and his movements slower than a turning leaf. "It's just me," he said quietly, his words little more than an exhale. "You can stay." No reply, of course. But the dog, Maple he would call her later, did not shrink back or snarl. She watched him as if measuring his shadow, her chest rising in short, uneven breaths. Will saw then the swelling of her belly, the ribs showing sharp beneath her coat, the way she kept her back leg drawn tight against herself. A scar traced down the length of her flank, half hidden beneath old hair. Will glanced around the basement, spotting a stack of old newspapers, a bent metal bowl. He rose slowly, left the door open, and went back upstairs. From his suitcase he took a small package of cold cuts, last of what he'd brought. He filled a ceramic bowl with water and returned to the steps. He placed the food and water halfway across the basement floor, close enough for the dog to smell, far enough she wouldn't feel cornered. Then he retreated, step by step, back to the landing. He did not look back as he closed the door, only paused to listen to the silence pressed up against wood. The day passed in steady, deliberate chores. Will fixed a dripping faucet, swept leaves from the porch, replaced broken panes in the living room window. Occasionally, he would pass the basement door and find it unchanged, save for the subtle absence of sound, a different kind of listening, one born of long practice with grief. Evening fell with the hush of rain on the roof. Will warmed a can of soup on the stove, ate it standing at the sink, eyes drifting to the darkened hallway. He wondered if the dog would stay or slip away through some broken panel. Part of him almost hoped she would. The weight of responsibility was a familiar, heavy thing. But as he prepared for bed, he noticed the food bowl had been dragged to the foot of the stairs, its contents gone, and a few muddy paw prints smudged the tile. The water bowl was empty, tipped to one side. Will smiled. A small, quiet thing. He rinsed the bowls, refilled them, and set them out again. Later, he sat in the living room, the only light a low lamp burning beside the old rocking chair. Rain tapped on the glass. Will listened, hands folded in his lap, thumb circling the cool face of his father's watch. The silence of the house felt less like emptiness now, and more like a pause, a breath held between verses. Somewhere beneath his feet, the dog was there. Two survivors, each cautious, each uncertain what came next, but joined now by the fragile thread of kindness. As the night deepened, Will found himself standing by the window, watching the storm flicker across the street. The town beyond was mostly dark, a faint glow from the diner at the crossroads, little more. He wondered, briefly, painfully, what his wife would have made of all this. The old house, the loneliness, the stray dog hiding in shadows. He wondered if the ache in his chest would ever soften. A soft sound reached his ears, a quiet movement on the stairs. He did not turn, but in the reflection of the window, he saw the dog's silhouette, just visible at the bottom landing. She watched him with the steady patience of the wounded. Will remained very still, letting the moment stretch and settle, like a stone easing into river silt. For the first time since arriving, he did not feel alone. Dawn arrived quietly, diffused through clouds the color of faded wool. Will woke to the creak of the old house settling, the muffled hush of rain still lingering on the roof. There was a new presence in the silence, a subtle shift, a feeling of someone else breathing, moving, even if only in another room. He sat for a while on the edge of the bed, listening. The ticking of the pocket watch was the only clock in the place, but time here seemed to move according to other rhythms. Slow, uncertain, measured by trust and habit more than by numbers. He made coffee, the smell filling the empty kitchen. When he opened the back door, the air was sharp with the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke drifting from some distant chimney. The ground glistened with last night's rain. Will stepped out onto the porch and stood a moment in his heavy boots, letting the chill settle into his bones. He liked the honest cold, the way it clarified things, stripped life back to what mattered. In the damp air, the world felt closer and quieter, as if waiting for someone to make the first move. He went about his morning routine, chopping wood beside the fence, stacking it neatly under the eaves, mending a loose slat with old nails he found in a coffee tin. These small tasks steadied him, their repetition a kind of prayer. Every so often, as he moved through the rooms, he would find a sign of Maple's cautious presence, a few muddy prints by the back door, a corner of the blanket dragged closer to the stove, tufts of fur on the landing. She stayed out of sight, lingering in the threshold between comfort and fear. The first few days unfolded in this delicate pattern. Maple hid when Will was near, emerging only when she thought him gone. Will respected her distance, never calling, never coaxing, only leaving food and water in the places she frequented. Sometimes, at dusk, he'd see her in the yard, head lowered, shoulders hunched against the wind, moving silently among the fallen leaves. Her shape blended with the autumn shadows, but there was a gravity in her movements, a quiet determination that matched his own. Once, as Will stacked kindling near the porch, he caught Maple watching from behind the slatted railing. Her eyes followed every motion, dark and clear and unblinking. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a flick of her tail, she vanished into the brush. He did not follow. Trust, he knew, was a slow-growing thing, not to be forced. Evenings in the house were spent in near silence. Will lit the stove, its glow painting soft amber across the kitchen floor. He prepared simple meals: toast, boiled potatoes, an apple eaten in careful slices. He washed up with water heated on the stove, wiped the counter, swept the floor, and folded the threadbare towel at the sink. The ordinary rituals of living became his anchor, and in their quiet repetition, he felt something inside him ease. Sometimes, as he worked, he talked softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the house itself, or perhaps to the ghosts he still carried. He would mention a memory, a fishing trip, the color of his wife's laughter in the morning light, the way his daughter used to draw hearts on fogged windows, and the house seemed to settle a little deeper into the earth. At night, he left a heavy wool blanket folded near the back stove. One evening, he found it nosed open, arranged into a soft nest. He smiled quietly to himself, resisting the urge to say anything out loud. Maple was claiming her place, inch by careful inch. One evening, after the first true frost, Will returned from the woodpile to see Maple sitting at the far end of the yard, her gaze on the horizon where the sun had just slipped away. He stood on the steps, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. The chill sharpened the lines of the world, turning breath to mist and silvering the grass. Maple lifted her nose, catching the scent of something far off, a memory maybe, or the simple animal knowing of another winter coming. For a moment, she looked toward Will, eyes bright in the dusk, and he nodded, just once as if to say, "I see you." Inside, the house was warmer. Will poured a bowl of water, set it in the kitchen, and left the door ajar. He sat in the rocker, reading an old paperback by lamplight. After an hour, he heard Maple's careful steps on the linoleum. He did not turn, only listened as she drank, each lapping sound a small testament to the fragile trust blooming between them. Days passed. Will continued his quiet repairs, fixing the porch rail, oiling squeaking hinges, sanding the sill of the bedroom window. He made no great changes, just small acts of tending, believing that a house, like a life, might be coaxed back from neglect through gentle, steady care. Maple mirrored him in her way, patrolling the rooms at night, leaving less of herself hidden. Once, Will found her asleep on the blanket by the stove, her breathing slow, her legs twitching in a dream. He did not disturb her. Instead, he watched the rise and fall of her chest, the way her paws curled protectively around her belly. Late one night, with frost thickening on the windows, Will quietly laid a piece of ham on a plate and placed it beside the blanket. The next morning, the plate was empty, the edges licked clean. Maple had not run. She had stayed. A tentative peace settled between them, woven from patience and absence of expectation. Two wounded souls, sharing space. Neither asked for more. Neither needed to. The days grew colder, but the quiet grew warmer, and for the first time since he could remember, Will found himself hoping the winter might last. The rain came hard and sudden, sweeping in from the foothills and filling every hollow of the small town with its steady drum. By mid-afternoon, the house stood wrapped in a fog so thick the street out front disappeared, and even the distant shapes of the birch and maple trees seemed to drift in and out of existence. Birchfield was a quiet place in the rain. Doors shut early, cars left in driveways, porch lights winking on against the gloom. Inside the old house, Will kept to his routines, moving from room to room with a hammer or a rag, the windows rattling to each distant clap of thunder. There was comfort in these small repairs, replacing a door hinge, reattaching a loose board to the kitchen step, tightening an old pipe in the bathroom. Each task kept his hands busy, but beneath it all was a persistent quiet, an awareness of something else breathing in the house, something almost like hope, cautious and thin but growing. Maple spent the day as a shadow, watching from thresholds, rarely coming close. Rainwater pooled beneath the door, gathering in the grooves of the floor. In the afternoon, Will set an old enamel bowl just inside the back entrance, catching the worst of the leak. He found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see her behind him. That evening, the storm worsened. Water leaked through a seam in the roof, dripping onto the living room floor with soft, measured persistence. Will placed a saucepan beneath it and listened to its hollow notes as he prepared a simple meal. Potatoes sliced thin, sautéed with onions in an old skillet. The sharp scent rose and mixed with the damp, woodsy air. Outside, rain lashed the windows, making rivers of the glass. The yard was a blur of movement, branches tossing, leaves tumbling across the earth. Will stood a long moment at the back door, watching the storm sweep through the yard, coat draped over his arm. He could see Maple huddled beneath the low porch roof, pressed into herself, her body shivering with each burst of wind. Without a word, he stepped out. The rain found him instantly, soaking through his shirt, but he moved gently, slow as the shadow of an old tree. He knelt beside Maple and draped his worn coat over her back. She stiffened at first, startled by the touch, but then her trembling stilled. For a moment, neither moved. The storm rolled over them both, fierce and impersonal, but Will's hand rested just above Maple's shoulder, offering warmth with no demand. He spoke only once, voice nearly lost in the rain. "It's all right now." He waited there, crouched beside her, long after his knees ached from the cold. Finally, when the thunder rolled farther into the distance and the wind softened, Maple pushed herself upright. The coat slipped off her shoulders and she pressed her nose briefly into Will's palm, a hesitant, fleeting gesture that made him go still. Her eyes found his, and in them he saw something older than fear. recognition perhaps, or simple, aching gratitude. They crossed the slick porch together, and when they reached the door, Maple hesitated. Will pushed the door open wide and stepped aside, letting her choose. She entered, slow and wary, water trailing from her fur onto the floorboards. Will dried her gently with an old towel, each stroke careful, deliberate. Maple did not flinch. He made a place for her by the stove, a bed of towels and his own flannel shirt, layered and warm. Maple settled there, her body curling into the smallest shape she could manage, the fire's orange glow catching in her dark eyes. That night, as rain battered the windows and the house groaned under the weight of weather, Will sat at the kitchen table, turning an apple in his hand. The rooms were full of quiet, the rhythmic patter of water in the pan, the sigh of the fire, Maple's steady breathing. Will's thoughts drifted, circling old losses, the way his wife's laughter would echo down the hall, the weight of his daughter asleep against his shoulder, the sharp and ordinary ache of every day after they were gone. He did not speak these memories aloud. Instead, he peeled the apple in a single, spiraling strip, sharing the slices with Maple, who ate from his hand with slow, careful bites. Later, unable to sleep, Will sat on the living room floor, his back against the wall, legs stretched out before him. The fire cast their shadows up high, two quiet shapes sharing space. Maple crept close, not touching but near enough that he could feel her warmth. Without thinking, Will reached out. Maple lowered her head, pressing it just once against his knee. He let his hand rest on her neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath skin and fur. Outside, the storm was fading, rain giving way to the hush of a world washed clean. The moment stretched, weightless, wordless. Grief lingered between them, but something else too, the first faint stirring of belonging. For the first time in many years, Will let his eyes close, his hand on Maple's back. They sat together, listening to the last drops of rain and the sound of their own breathing, the kind of silence that heals, cell by quiet cell, what the world has broken. The morning after the storm dawned glassy and bright, the sun sharp and new on every blade of wet grass. Will stood in the doorway, mug steaming in his hands, and breathed in the scent of earth rinsed clean. The wind had changed. It carried something brisk, not quite winter, but close. The old maple in the front yard held onto its last leaves with quiet stubbornness. Beneath it, puddles mirrored a sky swept free of clouds. Inside, the house felt different. Not warmer, not yet, but less haunted. The rain had found every weakness in the roof, but it had also seemed to wash away some of the heaviness lingering in corners, the stale silence that clung to old wood. In the kitchen, Maple lay curled on the towel bed, her sides rising and falling with the gentle exhaustion of trust finally allowed to rest. Will moved quietly around her, making oatmeal on the stove, whistling under his breath, a tune from nowhere, just an idle shape of sound. When he set a small bowl down near Maple, she opened her eyes and, with a slow stretch, got to her feet. Her movements were careful, not from fear, but from the memory of how life could hurt. Will noticed again how her back leg trembled when she stood, the way she held it just off the ground, shifting her weight as she ate. He knelt beside her as she finished, towel in hand. Maple paused, looking at him, and for a moment Will waited, letting her decide. She leaned into his touch, and he began to gently dry her coat, moving over patches of fur with slow, sure strokes. That's when he saw the scars. They revealed themselves beneath his careful hands, thin white lines running along her flank and shoulders, a rough patch on her left ear, folded over from an old wound, a jagged line by her ribs, as if something once tried to chain her too tight. Each mark told its own story, none of them spoken, all of them worn in silence. Will didn't say a word. He simply kept working, pausing now and then to let Maple sniff his hand, to reassure her without sound. When he reached her belly, swollen and round, his breath caught. There was life there. Life that had survived every scar, every season. Maple turned her head, met his gaze, and something passed between them that was not pity, not sadness, but a deep, mutual understanding. The past was not erased, but it could be carried together. After he finished, Will stood and stretched, feeling the ache in his back, the way old bones kept old secrets. He moved through the house, cleaning up the remains of the night before when a glint of metal caught his eye in the utility room. Half buried beneath a pile of dusty rags was a collar, leather worn smooth and cracked, the tag nearly illegible. Will brushed it clean and brought it to the sink, turning it over in his hands. On the tag, the name had faded, but a series of numbers, once a phone number, remained, only half visible. There was a notch on the inside edge, as if someone had tried to scratch it off. Will traced the outline with his thumb, then glanced back at Maple, now dozing again in the warmth of the kitchen. He wondered who had once called her home, who had pressed their face to her fur and whispered comfort before the world grew cold. In the bottom of a battered tin box on the shelf, he found a photograph, old, bent at the corners. In it, Maple sat proudly in a red vest beside a woman whose face had been mostly cropped out, an arm thrown around the dog's neck. There was snow in the background, sun sharp on the drifts, both of them looking toward something beyond the frame. Will studied it for a long time, feeling the weight of the years between then and now. He took the collar, cleaned it as best he could, and returned to Maple's side. Kneeling, he let her sniff it, watched her nose twitch as she considered the old leather, the memory in the metal. With quiet hands, Will fastened the collar around her neck, not as a tether but as a gesture, a way of returning a name, a history, a belonging that had been lost but not forgotten. Maple, he said softly, not as a question but as a homecoming. You can stay if you want. That evening, the house glowed with a gentler light. Will sat at the table peeling apples for a pie he might never finish, pausing now and then to glance at Maple curled by the stove. The simple act of naming, of restoring what had been stolen, settled something in him as well. He thought of his own scars, not all visible, the ache in his hands, the sleepless hours, the empty spaces at the table. Each pain, each loss had shaped him, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt those sharp edges soften. He rose, placed a small plate with apple slices by Maple, and watched as she took them, one by one. The night came quietly, with no storm, only the hush of wind in the eaves and the steady pulse of two lives, marked but enduring, sharing warmth and silence, and the slow, patient work of healing. Winter pressed at the windows, insistent and silent. The air inside the house seemed to settle even more, thick with anticipation, as though the old wood and stone themselves were waiting for something to change. Will noticed it in the way Maple moved, her steps slower, the rise and fall of her belly deeper with every breath. She spent more time near the stove, curling into herself, her eyes following Will as he moved through the day. He prepared for the coming cold as best he could. Each morning, he brought in firewood, stacking it neatly by the door. feeling the ache in his hands and shoulders, but welcoming the familiar rhythm. Maple watched from her place by the hearth, her nose occasionally pressed to the window pane, fogging it with the warmth of her breath. Sometimes she would turn her head to watch him, as if making sure he would not disappear. One night, the wind began to howl, carrying with it the fine, dry sting of snow. Will made a bed in the corner with towels and extra blankets, folding them carefully to cradle Maple's swollen body. He filled a basin with warm water, laid out an old flannel shirt, and set a lantern nearby. He moved through these preparations with the same quiet focus he'd brought to every difficult night of his life. No ceremony, only purpose. He paused sometimes, looking at Maple, searching her eyes for any sign of fear. When the first contractions came, Maple was restless, shifting from side to side, breath coming in shallow pants. Will sat nearby on the floor, knees drawn to his chest, hands folded loosely. He did not touch her at first, just waited, breathing with her, his presence a quiet tether. The storm outside rattled the shutters, but inside, there was only the hush of two living things facing the work of survival. Hours passed in this way. Will murmured comfort now and then, not with words, but in the small sounds of reassurance, a gentle clearing of his throat, the soft click of the lantern's glass, the familiar timbre of his boots on the floor. Maple's eyes found him often, searching, holding, then letting go again as another wave of pain washed through her. The first pup came in the dark before dawn, small and wet and impossibly still. Maple nudged it with her nose, licking fiercely, willing life into the trembling body. Will watched, hardly daring to breathe until he saw a shudder, a weak, defiant gasp. Relief struck him so sharply that his eyes filled before he could look away. He handed Maple a towel, his hand shaking just enough to betray the gravity of the moment. Another contraction, another pup, and then another. Maple worked through each pain with a stubborn, silent courage. Will wiped each tiny creature with care, nestling them into the curve of Maple's belly, the soft, steady thud of her heartbeat guiding them home. The house was full of the smallest sounds, a squeal, a rustle, the delicate hush of new breath meeting cold air. When the fourth pup arrived, Will realized he was smiling, not a broad grin, but a gentle lifting at the corners of his mouth, a movement that had felt foreign for so long he almost didn't recognize it. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, feeling the heat of tears, and let the moment pass without shame. Dawn crept slowly into the world, silvering the frost on the windows, painting the room with a light that was almost blue. Will sat back, legs stretched out in front of him, watching Maple curl herself around the pile of damp, wriggling life. The pups, barely larger than his palm, rooted for warmth, mewling softly. Maple licked each one in turn, cleaning them with methodical tenderness. The silence that settled over the room was complete. Not empty, but rich, brimming with the presence of something unspoken and holy. For the first time in many winters, the house felt like it belonged to the living, not to ghosts. Will rose slowly, his joints stiff, and went to put the kettle on. As the water heated, he looked back to see Maple watching him, her eyes soft, her ears relaxed. She seemed older now, tired but peaceful, her duty fulfilled. The pups nestled closer, small and fragile, each one marked with the same pattern of gold and black, one with a spot of white on its chest. He poured himself a mug, the steam rising in the pale light, and leaned against the counter, savoring the simple pleasure of warmth in his hands. He did not try to name what he felt, only let it move through him, settling in the spaces that had ached for too long. Later, as Maple slept, Will knelt beside her. He reached out, letting his hand rest gently on her side, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath, the tiny pulses of life beneath her fur. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened. The soft sigh of wind outside, the faint crackle of embers, the hopeful, endless sound of new hearts beating in the dark. Something inside him loosened, old grief giving way, if only for an hour, to gratitude. The morning light entered the house thin and gray, filtering through the cracks in the old wooden blinds. Frost outlined the window panes, tiny crystals catching on the edge of chipped glass. Will moved quietly through the rooms, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet. Maple lay curled on her towel bed, paws tucked beneath her, eyes half closed but alert. The pups, still tiny and wobbly, nestled against her side, their soft breathing the only sound in the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the skeletal trees, sending a scatter of dead leaves across the yard and rattling the remnants of the old fence. Will's thoughts drifted to the photograph he had found in the kitchen drawer the night before. Maple, proud and alert, wearing a faded vest, next to a woman whose face was largely cropped out of the frame. Snow sparkled in the background, sun sharp on the drifts. He had traced his fingers along the edges of the photo, the corners curling with age. The memory captured in that small square of paper felt like a key, a thread he needed to follow. He rose slowly, pulling on a heavy coat, and retrieved the collar from the small box he had set aside. The tag was worn and scratched, the numbers half legible, and the edges of the metal rounded from years of handling. Will brushed it carefully, feeling the ridges under his fingers, then placed it gently back around Maple's neck. The dog's eyes met his again, dark and steady, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition, a faint echo of a life she had once known. The search for her past became an act of reverence. Will called the numbers that were still decipherable, leaving messages with the quiet, deliberate tone of a man accustomed to patience. He sent photographs to local shelters, rescue organizations, and animal control agencies. Each reply, or lack thereof, layered on him a sense of the world's small indifference, yet also hinted at the possibility of connection. By midday, the wind had shifted, and the sun broke weakly through the clouds, casting thin shafts of light onto the living room floor. Will watched the light play across Maple's fur, each strand catching the glow differently, emphasizing her golden-brown coat streaked with black. She moved cautiously, following him into the kitchen as he prepared a small meal for the pups. Each movement she made was careful, deliberate, as if measuring the world again. Will marveled at her vigilance, the way she assessed every step, every shadow. She carried herself with the memory of 100 small dangers, her body taut and attentive. He settled at the table, leafing through the stack of correspondence he had received from shelters and volunteers. Among the handwritten notes and faded typed forms, one letter in particular drew his attention, a thin envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a careful, deliberate hand. Maple was a rescue dog trained for avalanche recovery. She was separated from our team during the winter storm 5 years ago. If she has found you, let her stay. She has chosen wisely. Will read the note twice, then pressed it against his chest. He allowed himself a small exhale. The acknowledgement of her past, the confirmation of a life once bright and full, mingled with the quiet relief that she had returned to safety. Maple, oblivious to the letter, watched him as he folded it carefully and set it on the table. Later, as he stacked firewood in the yard, Maple padded beside him, her head low, sniffing the damp ground. The pups tumbled between them, exploring their world with tentative steps. Will felt the weight of years in his shoulders, the aching of old muscles, yet there was a subtle lift to his heart. The knowledge that he was not only keeping Maple safe, but helping her reclaim fragments of her past lent him a quiet purpose. By late afternoon, he had composed a careful reply to the rescue coordinator who had sent the letter. He described her current condition, the puppies, the slow but steady return of trust. He refrained from embellishment. He wrote only what was true, measured, deliberate. The act itself was healing, not just for Maple, but for him. He had spent years holding back, containing himself, and now he was part of something that asked for nothing more than care and attention. As dusk fell, the house softened under the last light of day. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching across the worn floorboards. Will entered the living room to find Maple sitting upright on her bed, her gaze fixed toward the hallway. He paused, sensing that she was aware of something beyond the immediate. The physical space, something perhaps left behind in her memory. He sat quietly beside her, legs crossed, hand resting gently on her flank. The pups nestled against her, breathing softly. The first soft whimpers of the smallest pup drew his attention. He leaned forward, letting his palm brush over the tiny form. Maple's head turned just enough to meet his eyes, and he understood. The act of nurturing, the reclamation of past connections, was as much for her as it was for him. Together, they had become custodians of something precious, a fragile bridge between memory and presence. Night drew on, and the house settled into its rhythm. Outside, the wind whispered through the skeletal trees, leaves scraping against the window panes. Inside, the glow from the stove and a single lamp cast long, gentle shadows. Will allowed himself a quiet smile as he watched Maple stretch and lie down, carefully arranging herself around the pups. The world outside could wait. In this house, at this moment, two survivors, one man, one dog, found solace not in words, but in shared patience and understanding, in the silent promise that the past need not dictate the future. For hours he remained there, a sentinel beside them, aware of every breath, every twitch of ear or tail, each small life pulsing with tenuous hope. He realized then that healing was not a thunderous revelation, but a quiet accumulation of small gestures, a blanket, a meal, a steady presence. It was the recognition of each scar, seen and respected, and the patient, deliberate work of letting life return to its rhythms. Will allowed the stillness to fill him, the weight of loss softening into something lighter. Outside, the first stars pierced the winter sky, faint and steady. Inside, Maple's breathing slowed. The pups nestled warm beneath her. And Will understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched enough winters come and go, that this house, this strange, forgotten place, had become a sanctuary, not just for the dog, not just for him, but for the promise of a life reborn, one small, deliberate day at a time. The first morning frost of December came soft and quiet, like a sigh across the sleeping rooftops of Birchfield. It dusted the porch steps with a silvery sheen and painted the fence posts in delicate lace. Will rose early, as always, long before the town stirred. He moved through the kitchen in his flannel shirt, boots unlaced, his breath visible in the cold air. The old heater rattled faintly, still waking from the night. Maple was already up, standing near the window, ears alert. Her pups, now more than a week old, were growing fast, their legs stronger, their eyes just beginning to blink open. Each morning they made new sounds, new stumbles, new discoveries. The house had shifted around them, no longer just shelter, but something warmer, something beginning to feel like home. Out front, Will hammered the final nail into a new wooden gate. The original one had fallen years ago, rotted and splintered. This one stood straight, freshly painted, its hinges creaking like the voice of something learning to speak again. Behind it, he'd planted 2 small evergreens, young enough to be shaped by the wind, but strong enough to survive the winter. He stepped back, arms crossed, looking at the front of the house with a strange satisfaction. Not pride exactly, something quieter. The kind of feeling that rises when you bring a forgotten thing back to life with your own 2 hands. A whisper of usefulness, a reason to keep going. By late morning, a knock echoed through the hall. Not sharp or hurried, just 3 calm, patient raps. It was Mrs. Henderson, the retired librarian from down the road. She stood with a basket in one hand, and her purse looped over the other. Her thick gray scarf had come slightly undone, and she smelled faintly of cloves and winter apples. "I heard you were fixing up the Kane place," she said simply, handing him the basket. Inside were biscuits, still warm, and a jar of orange marmalade. Will didn't say much. He nodded, touched the brim of his cap. But something in the way he held the basket, carefully, like it might break, said thank you better than words could. Word traveled quietly in towns like Birchfield. By the end of the week, other neighbors had appeared. A man named George dropped off a sack of kindling. 2 teenage girls from the high school brought over old blankets for the pups. One child, a boy no more than 10, left a crayon drawing of a dog and her babies taped to the mailbox with a piece of yarn. Each gesture was small, but together they wove a net of gentle kindness. No one asked questions. No one demanded stories. They simply came, with muffins and gloves and quiet eyes that said, "We see you. We see her too." Maple didn't retreat anymore. She met them at the door now, tail low but wagging. She let hands reach her fur. She allowed herself to be seen. One afternoon, Will set up a few old chairs on the porch. He found a faded plaid blanket, the kind his wife used to drape over their couch, and laid it out for Maple beneath the railing. The sun was weak that day, but it was sun nonetheless. Maple curled into the warmth, her pups close by, and together they dozed as children's laughter floated up from the sidewalk. Will watched it all with a silence that wasn't heavy anymore. It was stillness, a kind of peace. That evening, a light snow began to fall. The flakes drifted slow and soft, landing on the wooden railing, the steps, the pups' tiny heads as they poked out of their bedding, confused and delighted. Will stood on the porch with a coffee mug wrapped in both hands. Behind him, the living room glowed with soft lamplight and the crackle of a radio playing old holiday tunes low and far away. From the road, a passing car slowed. It was Tom, the town's mechanic, his daughter in the passenger seat. She waved. Will raised his hand in return. That night, something shifted. The house, once empty, echoing with ghosts and wood creaks, now hummed with quiet life. The table had mail on it. The sink held 2 unwashed cups. There were muddy paw prints near the back door and a toy someone had left behind. It was not a perfect home, but it was a lived-in one. Will sat on the couch, the old dog curled at his feet. Maple had taken to resting there at the end of each day, her breathing soft and even, her body slightly curved around the growing pups. He looked at her now, her bent ear twitching in sleep, her sides rising and falling in rhythm with the warmth of the room. The fire flickered, throwing shadows on the walls. He reached down, his fingers brushing gently behind her ear. She stirred only slightly, then leaned into his touch. "You've brought them all here," he murmured. He didn't just mean the pups. He meant the neighbors, the laughter, the smell of cinnamon and pine, the loose thread of life weaving itself quietly back together. It wasn't about rescue, he realized. It was about return, a return to presence, to kindness, to the idea that home is not a structure, but a series of small permissions, to enter, to stay, to begin again. Outside, the wind gathered in the trees. The porch light blinked once, then steadied. Maple slept on. Will watched the fire. And somewhere, just beneath the hush of snowfall, Birchfield breathed in and exhaled together. The air carried a stillness that only midwinter could offer. Outside the house, a light snow had begun to fall again, finer than dust, softer than memory. It settled on the window ledges, the mailbox, the iron latch of the front gate Will had repaired with his own hands. Inside, the quiet was warm, but not idle. There was movement, slow, meaningful, like the hum of a house finally learning to breathe again. Will had just finished brushing sawdust from his palms. He'd been reinforcing the back porch where one of the steps had warped from frost. His breath fogged faintly as he stepped inside, boots heavy with snow, but his shoulders lighter than they'd been in years. Maple lay in her usual spot by the hearth. The pups splayed around her like spilled sunlight, twitching in dreams. Her coat had gained a fuller shine lately, though the scar behind her ear would always remain. Her eyes opened as Will passed, tracking him, not out of fear, but habit, comfort in routine. Then the letter came, delivered in a brown envelope, handwritten in looping cursive. "For Mr. Harlan and Maple, if she still remembers me." Will opened it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table. Maple approached as if she sensed something. She sat at his feet, head tilted, watching his face. Inside was a note, and a photo. The note was brief. "Dear Mr. Harlan, my name is Edna Breyer. I am 82 and not as sharp as I once was. But I remember Maple. She was mine once, before everything fell apart. I was the one who trained her for mountain rescue. She pulled a child from a snowbank once. She wore a vest, and we gave her medals, but we never gave her peace. I let her down. When my daughter passed and I moved into care, I couldn't keep her. I thought she'd be safe where I sent her. She wasn't. If she is still with you, and if she is willing, I would like to see her again. Just once. No expectations. Just a goodbye. With gratitude, Edna." Will didn't move for a long time. The only sound in the room was the soft crackle of the fire. He turned the photo over in his hand. Maple as a younger dog, strong and bright-eyed, seated beside a woman in a thick red coat with kind eyes and weathered hands. The same eyes that now asked for one final moment. That weekend, Edna arrived in a rust-colored sedan driven by her grandson. She stepped out slowly, leaning on a cane. Her coat hung heavy on her shoulders, and the cold made her breath tremble, but her gaze was steady. Will met her on the porch. No grand introductions, just a nod and a step aside to let her in. Maple stood in the living room, her body still, but alert. The pups were in their bed, unaware of the history pulsing between the walls. Edna's eyes welled up the moment she saw her. She whispered, "Maple, oh my brave girl." But Maple didn't move forward. She didn't growl, didn't hide. She simply stood her ground, staring. Not with resentment, not even confusion, just distance. Like recognizing an old song whose lyrics you once loved, but can no longer sing. Edna stepped closer. Slowly, her cane tapped gently on the hardwood. She stopped a few feet away and sank carefully into Will's rocking chair, the one that always leaned to the right. "I don't expect her to come," she murmured, voice almost to herself. "I just wanted to say, thank you for surviving." Maple looked at Will. He nodded once, nothing more than the bowing of his chin. Maple walked forward, not quickly, but not hesitant either. Her paws fell soft on the floor, and when she reached the edge of the rug, she sat. Not at Edna's feet, but near. That was enough. Edna let her tears fall then. She didn't try to pet Maple, didn't reach out, just sat in the chair, looking at the dog she had once trusted with lives. "I was old," she said softly, "but not too old to do better." Will stood in the corner, arms crossed, his eyes locked on the window. He didn't need to add anything. The moment belonged to them. After a while, Edna's grandson came to help her stand. Before she left, she turned to Will and said, "Thank you for keeping her alive." Will replied, not with words, but with a glance toward the hearth, where Maple had now returned to her place beside the pups. That night, the wind picked up again. Will sat on the porch after dark, wrapped in a wool blanket, a mug of tea cupped between his palms. Maple joined him, easing herself beside his boots, resting her chin on his socked foot. He looked down at her. "You chose to stay," he murmured. Her ear twitched. He thought about the letter, the photo, the way the woman's hand had trembled when she spoke, the way Maple had watched, not with anger, but with the quiet knowledge that sometimes pain simply needed to be witnessed, not solved. Behind them, the house glowed gently. The pups stirred in their sleep. Somewhere in the night, a branch creaked beneath the weight of ice. But inside their shared silence, there was no burden left to carry. Only this, a dog who could have run, but didn't. And a man who had expected to be alone forever, but wasn't. The winter thaw came slow to Birchfield. One morning in early March, Will stepped out onto the front porch and found the frost had finally lifted. The wood beneath his feet was damp, not frozen, and the maple tree by the fence, bare for months, held its first green bud, no bigger than a raindrop. The world hadn't bloomed yet. Not fully, but it had exhaled. Inside, the house no longer felt hollow. He could hear the distant shuffle of paws on the wood floor. A tiny yip, a bowl nudged out of place. Then silence again, as Maple settled the pups with one long sigh. They were almost 2 months old now. Bigger, bolder, chewing on shoes, chasing each other through doorways, curling into piles on warm afternoons. Each had their own quirk. One always barked at the reflection in the oven door. Another liked sleeping on his back, legs splayed like a dropped rag doll. Maple had grown slower, just a little. Her coat still thick, her eyes still bright. But her steps carried a gentler pace, a softness of knowing, of having fought, survived, and chosen peace. Will spent his days differently now. He sanded old shelves in the garage. He built low gates to keep the pups from the stairs. He chopped vegetables, brewed tea instead of just black coffee, and sometimes caught himself humming, quietly, absently, without realizing. There was laughter in the house, too. Not from Will, but from children who came by after school, from Mrs. Ellery next door, who stopped in with her lemon bars and didn't leave for an hour, from the vet tech who volunteered weekends to help with vaccines, from life. One afternoon, Will stood at the edge of the kitchen and looked around. On the fridge were drawings, colored scribbles of dogs and hearts and stick figures that small hands had insisted were Uncle Will and Mama Maple. On the walls, framed photos had begun to replace the old ones boxed in the attic. Maple under the porch with her pups, Sammy Parker grinning with a bandaged finger and a nuzzling puppy. The day Grace House, now officially registered, got its donation plaque from the town council. But it wasn't the photos that caught Will. It was a pair of muddy paw prints on the floor leading from the back door to the hearth. They weren't new. He hadn't bothered to wipe them up. He liked the way they broke the clean lines of the hardwood, as if someone had come home. Later that day, Will gathered the pups into the yard. It had become a ritual: midday sun, soft grass, a low fence that didn't really keep them in, just slowed them down enough to be caught. Maple lay in her favorite patch, front paws stretched long, head tilted, eyes following the wind. The pups tumbled over one another like waves. Will watched them, leaning on the railing, hands in his pockets. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, he called them in. Only one resisted, the smallest of the litter, crooked tail, sharp ears, too fast for his own feet. He darted under the porch, then peeked out with one dark eye, daring. Will crouched slowly. "Come on now," he said quietly. The pup paused, then ran straight for him. Will caught him mid-leap, the soft weight of life wriggling in his hands. "I guess you're staying too," he murmured. He named the pup Finch, because he was small, wild, and sang in his sleep. That night, after dinner, Will pulled the rocking chair out onto the porch. Maple followed, slow, with Finch trailing behind her, tugging at her tail. She eased herself beside Will's boots, just as she always had, and rested her head on his foot. Finch curled under her chin. The stars were beginning to return to the sky. Will looked up at them, then down at the dog at his feet, then at the little one who had chosen him without question. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old watch, the one his father had passed down, the one he used to wind each morning when he still wore a badge. He didn't wind it now. He just held it, then set it on the porch rail beside a cup of tea gone warm. "I think we're right where we're supposed to be," he whispered. Maple's tail gave one soft tap against the porch. Not a reply. Just agreement. Some souls don't return to where they came from. They find new places, new people. They don't ask for perfect. Just enough room to stay, enough quiet to rest, enough kindness to heal. The home we search for isn't always a house. Sometimes it's a worn porch, a second chance, and the steady weight of a dog's head on your foot as the world moves quietly on. The house Will bought was never just a house. It was a resting place for grief, for memory, for second chances. And Maple, scarred, quiet, unwilling to trust, didn't just survive there. She taught Will how to stay, how to soften, how to open the door again, and mean it. They didn't fix each other, but in their shared silence, in each act of patience, they became whole in a way neither had been in years. Maybe that's all healing is, not erasing the past, but finding someone who stays when it returns. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a loss, a quiet hope, I'd love to know. Have you ever been saved by simply being seen? Tell us in the comments if you feel ready, and if you believe, like Will and Maple did, that no soul is too broken to be chosen. Stay with us. More stories are waiting.